Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this web meeting on incineration-based WtE and their health impacts. There are close to 5 incineration-based waste-to-energy plants planned in Bangalore. We don't know whether that number is 5 or 7 because the RTIs that were filed have fetched sketchy information. We've got cancelled contracts, expired ones, new ones. So the number could very well be 5 to 7. Roughly around 2,000 to 3,000 tons of waste is expected to be incinerated in Bangalore. While many of us have been maintaining that incineration is not the solution, government and BBMP seems to be committed to pushing these polluting and unviable plans forward. So today, we'll hear from Katie Andresky of BreatheFree Detroit and Denise Patel from GAIA on how incinerators have impacted life of residents in developed countries. We have always been told fancy stories about how incinerators have solved waste problems in developed nations and how well they have been working. So today we hear firsthand. Today we hear from people who have had first-hand experiences of living near these polluting waste-to-energy plants. Katie Andresky has been a campaign organizer with BreatheFree Detroit. Her community has been living under the shadow of the incinerator for over a decade, and she has been a campaign organizer for more than a decade right now. She founded People's Organizations Against Incineration 2008 and hosted artists in the 2011 US Social Forum who created sunflower protest signs at the Yes Farm, her community art and agricultural space. She brings deep-seated environmental consciousness and creativity to her passion for growing healthy and equitable Detroit. Finally, they managed to shut down the incinerator in March 2019. So after we listen to Katie, we'll listen to Denise about some of the European and US experiments with WtEs and where they stand. She handles both Canada and US for GAIA. So over to you, Katie. Thank you.
So today I'm going to be discussing the lessons from BreatheFree Detroit and stopping an incinerator before it is built. Detroit shut down its incinerator that was built over 33 years ago, and we shut it down last year in March of 2019. So in my conversations with you today, I'm going to go over how to stop and why to stop an incinerator before it is built. I'm going to go through the Detroit's incinerator history, the harmful health effects, difficulties and importance of educating public officials, some strategies that we use that you also might find helpful, and also further resources. So my name is Katie Andresky. I'm the campaign organizer for BreatheFree Detroit, and I'm part of GAIA's Failing Incinerators cohort. So Detroit's incinerator is history, and part of our history is the longevity of the fight. So it is so important to stop an incinerator before it is built, because once it's built, these things are going to last in your communities and affect generations for over 30 years. It took us 33 years of fighting to shut down this incinerator. And we fought this incinerator before it was even built and continued to fight it into the time that the building was falling apart, causing an insane increase amount of air pollution toward the end. So this facility was just crumbling and pollution was pouring out a hole, a crack in the side of the stack. And nobody wanted to take responsibility for it in the end, and it had to shut down. So during this time that the incinerator was operating, the city, all of its zero waste efforts were stopped and were not supported. And so our zero waste efforts didn't actually start until after the incinerator shut down. That's when we really got to revamp a lot of our zero waste efforts. And we now work in a just transition to strengthen the community that remains, to rebuild our zero waste efforts, and support workers in healthier, greener jobs. We had a lot of harmful health effects from the Detroit incinerator. Asthma is 5 times higher in the area around the Detroit incinerator than anywhere else in the state of Michigan, making it the most dangerous place in the state to breathe. This asthma area was recorded for 3 to 5 miles radius of this incinerator. And this young people that would be moving into this neighborhood would be getting asthma when they moved in, even though they didn't have asthma when they were not living in this area. And if they had the chance to move out, their asthma would go away. I received stories along the campaign that a woman moved here with her child and put her kid in a school close to the incinerator. And when the child moved in, she was one of the fastest runners on track. After a period of time of living here, her respiratory issues and asthma started to evolve, and her mom tried to do everything she could, signed her up for swimming to strengthen her lungs, signed her up for to play instruments to strengthen her lung capacity, and nothing seemed to work to help her child make sure she continues on her path of being an amazing runner, until she ended up having to leave this neighborhood because she realized that it was this air that was stopping her child from being the best that she could be at the sport that she really loved to do. So pollution from this Detroit incinerator also caused premature death, non-fatal heart attacks, irregular heartbeat, decreased lung function, coughing and difficulty breathing. Children, older adults, and those with heart or lung disease are most likely to be affected. I know too many young women who have lost a child before birth and that are living within this area. I also have heard from doctors who would be treating young people and elderly with asthma problems in the hospital, and know that when they were sending them back home, they were sending them back into a dangerous place to breathe. Even though the incinerator is shut down, the effects are still harming the community that lives here. It's still a problematic area to live, because now COVID has affected so many residents within this area of the incinerator, because many people have ongoing respiratory issues and ongoing heart problems. And COVID is really attacking this area more than I'd ever want to see. I can help answer any other questions you might have about the health effects later on. I'm moving into now the difficulties and importance of educating public officials. So there's a lot of false narratives around incineration versus landfilling. Neither are a good option, as our campaign is still very much in support of zero waste economies and policies, but that is a slow change. We don't support landfilling, but in the end, landfilling is slightly better than incineration, and incineration is slightly worse than landfilling. And let me explain to you why that is. So when you are incinerating trash, incineration pollutes the air through burning materials that were not intended to be burned. These materials are being made, you know, plastic toys are being made for kids, and the manufacturer is not making these thinking that the end result of this is that it's going to be burned in an incinerator. And when you burn trash, a lot of chemicals come out of burning these pieces of plastic that wouldn't exist if they were not burned, like dioxin and furans. The soil and the water are also affected. Where these facilities are, where they are disposing of their fly ash is very concerning. Fly ash is, and the ash that comes from burning the trash is highly toxic. So what the toxins that are not put out into the air are captured with using filters, and all the stuff that's captured is then taken out in the form of ash. Ash comes out of the incinerating facility, and it makes up 1/3 of the trash that goes in. And this ash is then usually landfilled. It's either landfilled on site in an on-site facility, or in our case here in Michigan, it was used to top an or a landfill and mixed with soil. So in that case, you're actually still landfilling. You're taking even more toxic materials that would have never been created in the first place, and taking that and putting it into a landfill. And when this fly ash is put into a landfill, and you have very dry days, and the wind blows, it can go out into communities that live around the landfill facility. And in our case, that was agriculture and agricultural communities. And that ends up polluting the soil that's around the landfill and polluting the soil of the landfill. When it rains, the water comes through that fly ash, and the rain mixes with this toxic ash. And if your landfill is not tarped correctly, if it isn't built correctly, that water can then leak out and contaminate groundwater, drinking water, ecosystems that live around I'm missing the word. Ecosystems that are around the facility that retain water. And so these are all problems that are caused by incinerating, and wouldn't occur if landfilling. You wouldn't have such a mix of toxic materials that are from burning plastics that were not meant to burn in the first place. So the big question you need to ask yourself is, if you are okay with incinerating, are you okay and trusting of these facilities to operate correctly so that they catch all that can be caught in the wind and in the rain and in the air? Are you trusting these facilities to have the right and the most up-to-date filters? And even the most up-to-date filters are not filtering out the levels of dioxin that are healthy for humans to live. So even if you have the most up-to-date facility, it's still proven that it's not going to be the best. Another issue that incinerators have that I mentioned a little earlier is that recyclables and organic waste, which is compostables, become fuel. and that greatly reduces zero waste efforts for the region. So in Detroit, our zero waste efforts were mostly ignored by political officials until the incinerator closed. We were trying to increase zero waste efforts for over 15 years. And we still are building our recycling program, which only has 30% of the city actually has recycling. And we don't have any citywide composting. We're just starting to organize that. Once the incinerator closed, political officials got right to work to increase zero waste efforts. At a city meeting, they were unsure why the city didn't recycle, and they said, we need to start recycling right now. But it took the incinerator to close down before we were able to take large steps in this direction. So another thing is, a lot of people ask, what are the alternatives to incineration? So there are robust recycling programs and zero waste initiatives that can greatly reduce the amount of trash produced. According to GAIA, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, most of what we now waste can be safely and economically recycled, reused, composted, or turned into biogas. We also need to simply use less disposable stuff and redesign our products so that they are toxic free and built to last. So this isn't a system that can be built tomorrow, but there are so many great examples of communities building up these systems around the world that you can really see which one would work best for you. The hardest part is redesigning our products. So if a company is making something that is not recyclable and it's making something that's not compostable, we need to make sure that they change their product so that it can be recycled or composted, because we don't have enough space on this earth to keep throwing away how much we're throwing away right now. I'm going to talk really quickly about educating your public officials, because we found that that is the most important part of understanding incineration. Most public officials think that it's the best thing. It's going to be cheaper than landfilling, and it's reducing landfills and just makes trash disappear. But what they don't know is what is going on with the fly ash. They don't know what's going on with the ash. They don't understand the amount of generational health problems that'll occur around the facility. So we need to make sure that they know of these things as well. Part of our strategies for educating our public officials and our community were letter writing and postcards to public officials. And it's a really great strategy to use right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, because you don't have to really interact too much with people. This is one of the postcards that was made by a local artist who was a printmaker. And it was just very clear. It says, warning, polluted air from the incinerator in Detroit causes death, which it does. A lot of people here die 12 years before they're supposed to. Another strategy for educating public officials in our community is we created a report which can be found on our website, which is listed here. This report had everything from who owned it, who lives around it, what the problems were, how the health issues, and just about everything. So if you really want to understand a little bit more about the years of fighting an incinerator and all of the research we were able to do, you can look into that. One of our fights that relates to where you are was fighting Westland from burning recyclables. And so we had a political champion. So we had a politician that was a champion of us shutting down the incinerator. Our Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, notified us that Westland, a city near Detroit, was going to send their recyclables to burn in our incinerator because they had no other place to send it. And China had stopped receiving our recycling, and our recycling here in the United States just started piling up. So the city decided that they were going to burn it instead of putting it into a landfill because there was no other place for it to go. And when we found out about this, we had less than 24 hours to fight this. And we got into action right away. And we just call out all of our people. As you see, there's 1,300 people that responded to this action at the bottom. So it was an eye-opening experience in understanding how little political officials actually understand of the harmful effects of incineration. They had little resources and knowledge of the harms. Our campaign's website was the only resource they found in their efforts to educate themselves. Our calls and willingness to inform and our personal stories of health effects turned enough votes to stop this from happening. So we called them every day, all day, and then we ended up going to the meeting in the evening and sharing our own personal health problems. And the city council decided to change enough, they personally decided to change enough votes to stop this from happening. There were angry officials in this meeting that didn't expect this turn of events. And we did this in less than 24 hours. So it was just so surprising. So I do not want you to underestimate urgency. And one of our political champions alerted us, Rashida Tlaib. So you should be ready to educate yourselves and your community and your officials, because once folks know the full side of understanding incineration, it may be good in reducing waste, but that waste is reduced to very toxic waste and usually isn't treated correctly. So if this city wanted to send us their plastics to burn, it would have caused a lot more dioxin and furans and chemicals in the air that would have directly affected me and my community here. So to learn more about all of this, there are a ton of resources available to you. The best news is that you have an entire global alliance on your side. GAIA's resources are immense and will be useful in your efforts to stop this incinerator before it's built. I also urge you to use your allies closest to you. Community members living near this facility will become the experts in the health problems within this region. Unfortunate experts, I want to add, because the folks that are experiencing the biggest health problems are going to be the ones that know most about it. But hopefully it doesn't come to that. But these communities living near your current composting facility probably already stand against the smells. And they will be great, passionate allies in this fight, since it will affect their family and possibly generations to come. I also wanted to mention here that the incinerator that we had here also smelled quite a bit. I couldn't have very many outdoor gatherings in the summertime, especially because the rotting garbage smell would persist. And this is the second summer that I've had without an incinerator, and the smell is unrecognizable. I smell the rain, I smell the heat of the summer in the trees and the flowers, and it's just so much better than smelling rotting trash. Any business that's around the proposed facility should know that they'll be bringing their workers into a harmful work environment. And also, I always encourage youth to be involved in any environmental fight, because this is going to be their world next. So youth are great, and they're able to get the word out in ways that speak to everyone. So I wish you all luck, and my contact is here at the bottom if you have any further questions that may come after this and you want to ask more about my personal experiences in living near an incinerator and fighting one to shut down. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. So thank you, Katie, for that. I'm sure discussion. I'm sure it would be an eye opener for many in Bangalore. I mean, I was having a conversation with Audit just before this, when Audit was talking about the proponents of these waste to energy plants, saying that new technologies are very good. I remember you mentioning to me about the study that was done in the US about new incinerators and their ill effects. Probably we can talk about it during the Q&A. And a lot of questions have come up already, so probably we'll cover that immediately after after Denise's presentation. So we have Denise Patel with us. So she is the US Program Director and Regional Coordinator for the US-Canada region of GAIA. She has previously worked on campaigns and policy development with labor, environmental justice organizations on toxic and chemical safety. And she has also worked on fossil fuel disinvestment and climate change, with focus on improving environmental and occupational health. So Denise is based in New York City. She was the one whom I initially reached out to. She was kind enough to put me in touch with Katie to understand the problems that they face in Detroit. Over to you, Denise. You can talk to us about what GAIA does and what are the problems that you have found across incinerators in US and Canada.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. Thank you all for having me participate in your webinar today. I'm really happy to be talking to you about waste incineration, and I'm excited that I get to follow Katie, who's an amazing organizer and has done wonderful work in Detroit. As Deepu mentioned, I'm with the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, where we are a worldwide alliance of more than 800 grassroots groups, NGOs, and individuals that operate in 90 countries, whose ultimate vision is a just, toxic-free world without incineration. Our members in GAIA are global leaders in advancing visionary win-win solutions for waste and pollution that protect the environment and human well-being and build strong participatory local economies. We strategize together, we set goals together and targets together. We love to share information online through regional meetings, through webinars like this one, to campaign towards our common goals. We also provide a lot of trainings and skill shares and community support for each other. So again, like I said, I'm really excited to be here, and I think one of the best examples of what we do is work with groups like BreatheFree Detroit and then bring them forward into conversations with communities around the world who are also interested in fighting incineration and improving waste management in their own communities. So as Deepu mentioned, I'm the program director for the US and Canada region of GAIA. We have 5 regions, including a region in Europe, Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. And in the US, incinerators are hopefully, as we're working very hard to do this, on their way out of existence. The majority of incinerators in the US were built a long time ago, and they are located primarily in environmental justice communities. And when we say environmental justice communities in the US, we are referring to communities that are specifically very low income, Many of them are people who live below the poverty rate in the US, and also communities that are majority people of color. So in the US, this is very similar to the way you would think of the caste system in India, where race really does determine your health and what your community looks like. As I mentioned, we believe that incinerators in the US are in decline. US municipal solid waste incinerators face significant challenges. The majority of them are 30 years old, and they are subject to a volatile revenue model. So incinerators in the US depend on tipping fees, and a tipping fee is essentially an amount of money that is paid for the incinerator to take the waste. And so municipalities, like cities and counties, sometimes states and businesses will actually pay to have their waste burned in an incinerator. There's also a number of incinerators that benefit from subsidies and renewable energy credits in the US, and that just incentivizes them to continue to keep burning trash because they're actually being subsidized for doing that, and being labeled as renewable energy, which in fact waste is not considered renewable energy, especially in my opinion, because although we're producing a lot of waste, it's not renewable like wind and solar. We know that burning trash in the US is the most expensive form of waste management, and it costs more in terms of energy production than burning coal or using nuclear power. As I mentioned, most of the incinerators are about 30 years old or more, which means they are aging. They cost a lot to operate. They have a lot of maintenance issues, which actually adds to the pollution problem. There's a lot of toxic emissions that come out of incinerators, as KT mentioned, and a lot of those emissions are related to the fact that the technology in those incinerators are very old, or they need to be upgraded. They need new filters or bag houses and things like that. And not only have no new incinerators been built in the last 15 years, but 31 incinerators have actually closed since 2000. Since the year 2000, because of insufficient revenue or the inability to afford required upgrades. So from a cost perspective and a financial perspective, incinerators are really having a lot of trouble continuing to operate and are really dependent on municipalities, and in the US especially taxpayers, to support their continuation. Increasing attention is now going towards zero waste and environmental justice and climate change. So KT talked a lot about the factors that went into shutting down the incinerator in Detroit, and a lot of that was very much driven by community power. It was community power not just pushing to close a polluting facility in their community, because it was considered an environmental justice issue, and the people being impacted were disproportionately impacted, primarily low-income people and people of color. It's increasingly being recognized as adding to greenhouse gas emissions and contributing to climate change. And there's increasing efforts to move towards zero waste systems and actually address waste from the get-go, and instead of producing and continuing to produce more and more waste, using the waste hierarchy to lead to waste reduction. As I mentioned, the people in the community who are most impacted, we've got about 80% of the municipal solid waste incinerators in the US there's about 4.4 million people who live within a 3-mile radius of the incinerator. We use 3 miles because that's about the amount, depending on wind conditions, about how far the emissions from an incinerator can actually move through the air. Approximately 1.6 million people live within that 3-mile radius. We actually put out a report last year in 2019, which looked at the most polluting facilities in the US and identified the top 12 worst polluting. And those facilities were considered the most polluting because they were the top emitters of PM 2.5, so that's black carbon, nitrous oxide, lead, and mercury. And we know that all of these contribute to poor health and cause significant health impacts by either contributing to low-level air pollution, like ozone, which can exacerbate asthma and other respiratory conditions, or lead and mercury, which can impact reproductive health and development and neurological development. We know that 10 out of 12 of those incinerators that emitted the greatest amount of lead emissions were in EJ communities. And we also know that lead, there's really no safe level of exposure of lead. It's been pretty much established by the public health community that lead exposure, particularly in children and in pregnant women or women of childbearing age, because lead actually lives in your blood system for quite a number of years, has significant impact on child development and reproductive development as well. And then just to note that the top 3 incinerators in the country were in Baltimore, Camden, and Newark, New Jersey. So these are some of the oldest incinerators in the country. And in the US, they're really in the Northeast. There have been a number of campaigns of communities that have been fighting back. Katie mentioned that there's been an increase of waste going to incinerators because of the China National Sword Policy, which essentially said that China, who had been the country that had been the primary market for plastic waste recycling, and for US and for European countries in particular to ship their waste to for further recycling, decided to reject acceptance of recycling of plastic recyclables. And that was essentially because the market bottomed out underneath them. And even though they had developed entire industries around plastic waste recycling, a lot of the plastic that was being sent to China was actually not really recyclable. It was contaminated, and there were a number of problems with it. And so when China decided to stop accepting a lot of that plastic waste, other Asian countries started to accept it and soon realized they were having similar problems, including a lot of pollution in the communities where those facilities were operating. And so communities in the US, and particularly cities who had been shipping waste out of the country and actually making and balancing their municipal budgets and waste operations by doing this, by selling all of that plastic waste out, we're finding that not only did they face a deficit around waste management in their municipal budgets, but they also were piling up with all of this waste that had been collected for recycling. And a lot of that recycling waste actually ended up going to incinerators. One of the stories that came out last year, or actually in towards the end of 2018 and early 2019, was around a community in Chester, which is located in Philadelphia, or just outside Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, that discovered that all of this recycling waste was being sent to their incinerator. It's one of the oldest and one of the most polluting incinerators in the entire country. They immediately caught wind of it, contacted their local officials. We helped them get a lot of media attention around it, and were able to stop the recycling waste from being sent to the incinerator itself, which was a huge win. And it happened very quickly, and it wouldn't have happened without a lot of the community organizing that happened, in particular by one really well-known activist in her community in Chester named Zuline Mayfield. So that's a little bit of a rundown about US incinerators. I know there were a lot of questions about European waste incinerators. So the US really represents old incineration technology. And what we're hearing from Europe is a lot about new incineration technology. And that's that's being sold around the world. And I know that's one of the things that's happening in your community as well. So there are about 500 municipal solid waste incinerators in Europe. In the 90s and early 2000s, the European Waste Framework Directive promoted the waste hierarchy, which really focuses on reduction and reuse and recycling, and established recycling targets. But in that effort, it incentivized incineration through renewable energy credits. And I can't emphasize this enough. I know there's a lot of increasing action around addressing climate change, and increasingly we're seeing arguments that incinerators somehow are better are more sustainable and better for the climate than other forms of waste management. But in reality, we all know that the best method to reduce climate emissions related to our waste is to not create it in the first place. The countries that faced overcapacity issues, meaning that they had incinerators that were built, but they didn't have enough waste to burn, started importing waste from other European countries. And so it created an even greater burden on the communities where those incinerators were built. In 2012, the EU started working on the resource efficiency strategy as it realized that waste incineration was counterproductive to Europe's circular economy policies and climate objectives. The EU as a whole has done a lot of work, especially through with support and involvement of Zero Waste Europe, which is the GAIA counterpart in Europe, to push for these policies and stronger policies around waste management and towards a circular economy. The strategy really served as a roadmap to the circular economy package that was enacted in 2018 and set a goal of reducing municipal waste by 50% by 2030. They do eventually plan to move towards 100% reduction. But I want to note that in Europe, they seem to be setting shorter timelines with more achievable targets that are still ambitious, but really reflect that there's going to be an ongoing level of work to get us to the circular economy and truly towards zero waste. The circular economy package, as I mentioned, is constantly evolving. There's been a lot of conversation in the US and in Europe and in other parts of the world around a Green New Deal. And so earlier this year, Europe launched its own Green New Deal and included the parts of the circular economy package within that. In that, they set the goals and said that they made commitments to make sustainable products the norm in the European Union. That's particularly through policies around extended producer responsibility, so really making producers of waste responsible for that. Empowering consumers and public buyers. Focusing on sectors that use the most resources and where the potential for circularity is really high. Ensuring less waste. Making circularity work for people, regions, and cities. And then leading global efforts in the circular economy. So not only are they moving towards circular economy and reducing waste, but they're really engaging on global efforts to make that a reality as well. But we've recognized that even with this new technology, we have the same old toxic problems. There have been multiple accidents from incinerators in industrialized countries, showing that the technology is not reliable. There are some examples of this in Barcelona, Lithuania, Netherlands, and in Denmark. And we can actually share these slides later as well. So you can actually click on those links and read more about those case studies that Zero Waste Europe has put together. We recognize that the dioxin emissions have continued. In 2019, the Norfos incinerator in Denmark registered the highest emissions ever from that facility at 3 times their legal limit. So even though the European Union has limits on the types of emissions and the amount of emissions allowed from incinerators, the incinerators have been violating those limits. A lot of this is happening because of unreliable testing, which really understated emissions levels, and it makes it harder to keep track of what's actually happening at the incinerator and to take enforcement actions against them. There are worrying levels of dioxins and furan emissions reported from the incinerator near Barcelona. And we know that the proposal that you all are facing is from a French company called 3Waste, which actually doesn't have any experience in operating incinerators. They really just license and work with their technology and work with local entities to launch those incinerators, but they actually themselves don't have experience running them, which you can imagine would lead to a lot of problems in addressing technological issues and pollution due to the inherent nature of those technologies and that are being used in the incinerators, even the new ones. And then I just want to highlight, if you've seen this, ski slope waste incinerator in Denmark. It's really been marketed around the world as being this like new technology that's incredibly efficient, but it's really the most expensive of its kind. It's been having technical problems since its opening in 2017. It has a serious overcapacity issue, so that it's requiring waste to be imported in order to be able to continue to burn and burn efficiently. A large amount of the recyclable plastic is actually being burned at that facility. And it's going to face increasing problems in terms of continuing to operate and financial hurdles, because the Danish government and parliament reached an agreement on reducing waste incineration as part of their climate neutrality goals by 2030. So eventually this incinerator is going to have to shut down anyway. And it's one of the newer ones. And at least I know from communities in the US, that the waste incineration companies and the industry actually hosts tours and takes people to these types of incinerator sites in Europe just to try to sell them. But we know that inherently they're very problematic. And finally, I just want to close out and let you know that we have a website called Zero Waste World. And so we've been talking a lot about why there needs to be alternatives to incineration. And in particular, that we need to focus on waste reduction. So GAIA has been partnering with communities around the world and starting to tell their stories about how they're building zero waste solutions right in their own communities that are community led. So you can go to zerowasteworld.org, which is the website featured here, and learn more about that. And you can read more about the impacts that the global waste trade has had around the world at wastetradestories.org. One of the things that we highlight in our efforts towards zero waste is that we have five pillars of zero waste. One is to set a goal to zero waste, going to dumps, landfills, and incinerators. Two is to hold producers accountable, so they design waste out from their business models, and consumers can actually do a lot, not only in the way that you choose what you purchase, but also by asking local vendors to actually create reuse systems and refill systems within their own shops, so you can actually go in and take your own containers and do refills and things like that. We want to encourage responsible consumption habits that respect ecological limits, build zero waste infrastructure to ensure that materials are reused, repaired, or failing that, recycled or composted. And then we, of course, want to prioritize social and environmental justice and making sure that everyone's voices, especially workers and communities in the front lines of the waste crisis, are heard and respected, and that they're part of the solution. So with that, I'm going to close and just wanted to share my contact information on the screen as well. And I think Deepu can share it out afterwards as well, if you all want.
Thank you, Denise. I think before your presentation, I spoke about the question that Odette posed to me right before this call about new incinerators and how they are faring. And since you covered it in your presentation, probably we can look at it again, towards the later part of the session if required. I mean, if Odette feels so. We can start off with questions. There are several questions that have come up. The first question is from Padma Venkat. So Padma Venkat asks, what's your opinion about incinerators specifically for sanitary napkins? I think this can be combined with another question that has come from Meenakshi Prabhu. So Meenakshi has asked, what is your opinion about how waste that cannot be recycled, right? So non-biodegradable, non-recyclable waste should be handled. I think these two questions can be combined. And the question is incineration a solution for these kinds of waste? Yeah, who wants to take it, Katie or Denise?
I can answer that question first, and if Katie wants to add anything to it, you can do that as well. So with non-recyclable waste and I think sanitary napkins, I know diapers has come up a lot as well as one of these issues. I think there are reusable options. I know society has really transitioned to more disposables. But there are alternatives that we could be using. making more affordable, as well as really doing a lot of education around why those products are better. A lot of cases are actually also better for your health, because sanitary napkins in particular can also include a lot of toxic chemicals in those products. In terms of the overall question of like non-recyclable waste, I think we really look to the waste hierarchy to address that, and in every product that we use. And so we're focused around ensuring that we are looking at them from that approach where we're reducing as much as possible, and that's like using different products and ensuring the things that we do use are reusable. Seeing if there are some compostable options where things can't be recycled. And I think there's a recognition that ultimately, once we get through that entire waste hierarchy, there will be some degree of waste that can't be, you really can't do anything with. And the best option for that is landfilling. But until we really, as people, like look at all of these things and then force change, not only with our own consumer use, but also systemically with the companies that are producing these products, that's going to be what it's really going to take for us to move away from those disposables and things like that.
Yeah, Katie?
I think the only thing I could add to that is that, you know, we have created this reliability on ease in our societies. You know, just 50 years ago, we were using cloth diapers, and I know that those are a lot of pain to wash, but there's, you know, a lot of options in reusable or products that are a lot more natural, that will decompose naturally, that can be composted. I know sanitary napkins and diapers and plastic bags take over 500 years to decompose in a landfill, but that does not mean that we should, you know, take the easiest option from there, because both options are bad, and burning these types of plastics are not the answer. So we really need to just make sure we change the product all around. And one of the ways is to just increase what we purchase. And so that's the little way that we can help, but also demanding that these companies change the products that they make.
Thanks, Katie. Denise. I think you also mentioned to me earlier that if the objective is to avoid landfilling, that anyway does not go away, because even after incineration, many of it has to be landfilled. So the only option is to reduce, the consumption of these. So we move to the next question. So Madhuri Mandava is asking about measurement of air pollution. So did you measure air pollution in that area, Katie?
We put up some air monitors right before the incinerator was going to be shut down. We didn't know it was actually going to shut down at that time. And we were measuring particulate matter 2.5 and 10 and NOx. So it is really difficult to get exact data of the health and air pollution and directly correlate it to one specific facility, because the facility will say, well, we're right next to a highway, there's a lot of cars and trucks, and that's the problem. But one of the things that did come out is the furan and dioxin levels of this region were only coming from the incinerator. So we were able to really specify that those chemicals were only coming from one facility, but all of the others, these facilities have a really tricky way of stating it's not our pollution, it's in the air, it must be coming from somewhere else. And it's also really hard to get a lot of data on the health problems, because, you know, health is usually a very personal thing. People usually don't want to talk about it. People don't usually want to share their own health problems. We had physicians then come join our campaign, and they had a lot of personal experiences treating kids in the region, in the area with asthma, and how they had such a hard time when they were bringing this child back to life from an asthma attack and sending them back home to a place that they knew was actually just causing them more harm. So most of our campaign and the strength of a lot of our campaign came from personal stories and personal experiences. We had parents come and tell us that their child was this, top track runner. And then they came to a school near the incinerator and they weren't able to run as fast. And then they did everything, got them to play music, an instrument to help with their lungs, went and did practice swimming and did everything. And nothing changed until they moved out of the area. So it's really hard to get those folks to be part of a study, but those personal experiences and personal stories really do move mountains when you're talking to public officials that rely on votes of community members and rely on the support of these types of meetings.
So while I'm taking questions from the chat window, in case anybody wants to ask, you can just raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask directly. The only request would be to keep the question brief, so that we have a chance to answer all the questions that are coming. Audit, I saw you raise your hand, so I'm just asking you to unmute yourself. You can pose the question directly.
It's just directly linked to what you said, Katie, about the people, the actual live accounts of people who've had health problems. Are these on video? Because if we have to convince people here, being able to place what somebody else said, saying I had this, like the child who was a runner, or those kind of things. Or could we have access to some of these? I think that will be powerful weapons in our fight over here.
I'll see what I can put together for you.
That would be super.
There might be some articles that are already written about some of this stuff. Most of it came when we were having town halls, which were just big gatherings to inform the community, and they were just spoken to us very passionately at a question and answer session. So a lot of this wasn't even recorded. And that's the importance of community organizing, is to carry these stories on, because these are the true stories and the real issues that are happening. Yet, it's not all the time that media is there, or like reporters or scientists are there to actually document. So I'll see what I can do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And the second thing, which I think he referred to, is I met someone who was actually selling these French WtE technology, and the way he sold it. Now I do know a little bit about it, and still I got taken in when he said, no, this is new, this is wonderful. The air that comes out is even more pure than the air around it. And I actually got taken in, whereas said the dioxin levels would still be higher. So can we have some hard facts about that? So we can actually counter such claims, because if we who are interested to stop incinerators are getting confused by this, imagine the gullible official who just wants to push something because he believes it's good.
Yes, I shared a report with Deepu, who can share it with everybody in the best way. And it's called the Egg Report, where they actually monitor the dioxin levels found in chicken eggs near incinerators up, I think it's in Norway. So I think this is for the facility, a newly built facility that said that there was going to be no problems like this, and they've been experiencing issues. And again, dioxin is only created from burning. It's not created in any other type of natural environment. It's from burning a specific plastic.
Thank you. So Nirupama is asking about the kind of arrangement that the city had with the facility in terms of the minimum waste that was supposed to be provided to the plant per day, and whether there were penalties that the city will have to pay if the amount was reduced, and probably about tipping fees as well.
Yeah, so I do have to say that I don't have the numbers of how much tonnage came per day in my head any longer, because I've been doing so much work with supporting the community now, and that kind of just left, and I'm doing so much different work now. But you can find that in our primer, our report that's on our website. I do know that the amount of trash that was required to operate the Detroit incinerator at full capacity, which had 5 boilers. Many of times would break down, and they would have to switch from one boiler to the next boiler, causing a lot of pollution in that switch. So if they're not burning at capacity, and they're burning, they don't have enough trash to burn all the time, there's a lot more carbon that goes out into the atmosphere. And so the city of Detroit was not able to actually make enough trash for this facility to operate correctly. So over the 33 years, we started receiving trash from Canada, from 5 different states around us. So not only is trash then coming in from other places, and we don't really know what it's made of, but it's also being transported. So we have so much more traffic and pollution that's added. And so we had a lot of different cities around Detroit that was shipping their trash here because the tipping fee was cheaper. It's about $10 a ton cheaper. And you could find all of those numbers in our report. So yeah, it was a cheaper option, so the city thought it was better for everybody, even though it was a lot more expensive for our health. And you can also find those numbers of how much it costs for the health problems of the communities that lived around the incinerator.
I was going to add one thing from a case in Maryland, in Baltimore County. So one of the concerns that we have, especially between the relationship between the city or municipality and the incinerator, is that they're often contracted for like years at a time. In the US, it used to be, most of the waste contracts are actually about 10 years long. And so they're only negotiated that one time every 10 years. It's been shifting a little bit more recently because there's been so much uncertainty in the market around waste production that some of those contracts are at least shortening in timeline. But last year, the County of Baltimore has an incinerator, and what ended up happening was the City of Baltimore was required to send a specific tonnage of waste to that incinerator, and I can't remember the exact number, but I do remember that what ended up happening was they didn't have enough waste to send, and so the incinerator company actually tried to sue Baltimore County for revenue lost from not having enough waste to send. Sorry about that. From not having enough waste actually being sent there. And so that's another way that municipalities are really at risk financially from these waste contracts, and just knowing that the incinerator companies and corporations themselves will take action in order to continue to operate, and that can have a significant impact on those communities.
I will try to combine 2 questions, one from Manoj Narayan and another from Anu Govind. Manoj is asking, was the waste that was being used in the incinerator segregated? Was biodegradable waste, is biodegradable waste segregated in the US? And Anu's question is, now that the incinerator is closed down, where is this waste sent to?
Right. So we would burn our biodegradable waste here, which was 50% of the weight of the waste that was coming in to the incinerator. The only separation that occurred there is that the waste pickers would sift through, the waste workers would sift through and make sure there wasn't anything combustible, so nothing that would explode in the incinerator. They would pick out large pieces of metal, but then after the everything else was burned, they would burn entire mattresses. After everything was burned, there would be a magnet that came and would take out any of the additional metal that could then be resold. But there was not any other type of separation, except one where they would take, the forestry department would send their trees and cut down trees to the incinerator as well. And as we know, trees, burn and emit only carbon dioxide, not furans or dioxin or lead or mercury. It's just trees. So they would actually separate that, and they would keep it in its own pile, so that when the state came to review the incinerator to see how the stacks and the filters were working, the incinerator then would choose to burn the wood and show that they were a lot cleaner burning when they were being inspected. And so they would save it for that time. So there was a separation for wood waste for very specific and tricky negative effects on our community.
So Ranjesh is asking about documented proof of health issues that you had because of the incinerator. I think Odette asked about videos of people who were impacted, and Ranjesh is asking about whether you have documented proof of health issues that were faced, and approximately what area around the plant was impacted because of these health issues.
So the area that's around the plant is there's a report, and again, you can find this information on our Detroit Primer report on our website, and there's even a references area where we've got all of that information from. So if you want to look deeper, you can look into the references of this report. And there was a study, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but there was a study about asthma in Detroit in general. So there was a citywide asthma report, and the incinerator area, which was about 3 mile radius, I think it was 3 to 5 mile radius that they were looking in, had a 5 times higher rate of asthma than anywhere else in the state of Michigan. So there was a report. I'm sorry I can't get you the name right now, but please look into our website for the Detroit Primer that we have there.
So Meenakshi Prabhu is asking, are there any types of plastics or material which in your opinion need to be banned from production? Any programs that have been initiated on the same? Probably Denise, you might want to take this.
Yes, so there are plenty of plastics that are not recyclable, and most of them actually aren't. And we're finding increasingly that the market is really being flooded by single-use plastics, which are that very thin plastic. Deepu ahead of our call mentioned the use of a lot of film and film packaging. None of that can actually be efficiently recycled. Basically, it's a type of plastic that what you need to do in order to efficiently recycle plastic is that you need to be able to break it down into smaller polymers, and then you're always downcycling the plastic. It never becomes the same quality of plastic that it was before. So eventually, no matter how many times you recycle that plastic, a portion of it just goes to waste and a portion of it gets turned into new plastic, but eventually all of it gets turned into waste. So there are a number of types of plastics that exist out in the world. They have different types of emissions when they are burned. So dioxins is one of the things that I know Katie's been mentioning a lot, comes from burning plastics. There are a lot of other types of like polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are emitted when plastic is burned. Those are also really harmful to human health. If you've heard about plastics, the soft plastics use bisphenol A, and that's a chemical that has been shown to be harmful to health. And so again, we really push for a reduction of plastic waste altogether. and elimination of a lot of plastic waste. And there is an entire movement called Break Free from Plastic that is really focused around addressing plastic issues in particular. Not only because the waste is a problem, but because the practice of actually extracting oil and gas from the ground is incredibly polluting for communities as well. It's an incredible contributor. The entire production of plastic is incredibly contributive to climate change. And so I would encourage you all to check out Break Free from Plastic. GAIA is one of the founding organizations of that movement. And there are a ton of resources on what to do about plastic waste specifically. And I can share those links around as well afterwards.
So yeah, I'd like to add really quickly too, there's a new documentary that's very thorough about plastic and waste and how much is actually recycled and where it goes and what happens to it across the world. And so if you have the chance to look at the story of plastic, it's a really great film. So write that one down, the story of plastic. I'll make sure to include it in a follow-up.
Thank you, Katie. Since you mentioned story of plastic, I think GAIA, we have two people from GAIA on this call. I think there was a question about GAIA in India and associates. So I'm just spotlighting Shibu. Shibu Nair is in India. He is a representative of GAIA. So he had come to Bangalore to talk to us as well. So I'm unable to unmute you, Shibu. 1 second, I've just unmuted you. So Shibu had come to Bangalore to speak to the folks in Electronic City, I think 6-7 months back. I had invited him to come down so that people here could understand the problems that we would face with WtE. He was kind enough to come and address us. So, to Sajid, who asked who is the representative, Shibu is the one.
Hi, I think you can actually reach me at shibu@noburn.org. I just typed my email ID here. And there is all these resources, especially on waste incineration and dioxins. It is available at www.noburn.org. And the Asia Pacific office is actually reaching out to the Asian region. And I think one more thing is that when you discuss about waste to energy or incinerator projects in India, there is one more dimension to it, that is actually investment scam, or it's kind of a financial crimes. Because we recently found that one of the company based in Bangalore is actually trying to recycle black money in the form of FDI. So they just come up with impossible project proposals that a politician can deny. So these all are the other factors which actually make it very difficult to fight waste to energy projects and to move with our zero waste initiatives at the grassroots level. So I am available even after this talk. People can just mail me, or you can just call me. Deepu got the contacts, and then we will discuss it later. Thank you.
So I think probably with your permission, Padma, Manoj, and RA, I think RA's was more a response to Manoj's comment about carbon neutrality. But we will probably move forward and address the next question, which has come from Jay Penn. So Jay Penn asks about incinerators in Singapore. Singapore, with their limitation of available land, rely heavily on incineration to manage their non-degradable solid waste. What is your take on their model on incineration as part of their zero waste strategy? So I think, Denise, Katie, and probably I will ask Shibu also to respond to this question. Would you want to take it, Denise?
Can you repeat the question for me?
Okay. Singapore, with their limitation of available land, relies heavily on incineration to manage their biodegradable solid waste. What is your take on their model on incineration as part of their zero waste strategy? I and Shibu has had a long conversation about it. So probably after you respond, probably I'll ask Shibu also to.
I think I'm just going to pass it to Shibu because I'm not that familiar with the Singapore model.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Shibu, over to you.
Okay. Singapore is the model for most of these politicians or the policymakers in India, especially because Singapore is very close to us, and when we can see. And even that NAS daily video has made it rounds in WhatsApps and Facebooks, and people see it's a kind of a magical facility. But I've been there in their facility in Singapore, and I have found that normally when you burn, like they claim it is to be complete combustion, but that complete combustion is not happening. There are semi-combusted materials are taking away, and they're just picking it, everything from the ash is being dumped into a landfill, which is, it's a kind of a artificial island created in between Malaysia and Singapore. So it's in the ocean floor. So it is the waste, the toxic ash waste is sitting in the ocean floor with a, at the top, like on the, it's layered with a beautiful garden. So people think that, okay, waste is very beautiful, but if the ocean floor cracks, that is going to affect the entire fishing population, or the aquatic ecosystem, going to affect especially in the South China Sea and Indian coast, and all the toxics will reach our food. So that is the other part. And anyway, it is happening, it is already leaking. So there are reports. And the way they are managing waste is actually a kind of a mixed burning. And though they claim to be very clean, in many other parts of Singapore, I've been to many parts of Singapore apart from the cities, then you will find waste is being even burnt or thrown. So I think Singapore is not a kind of a model for India, because it's a highly expensive in one side, and they can actually afford it just because of their economy, but it is not affordable for any Indian city or any Asian other like countries like, similar to India. So they are actually doing burning. It's mass burning. When we asked questions about dioxins, there were no answers. When we asked about the toxicity of ash, no answers. So they don't even allow some questions when you visit their farm. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to just add in general that none of these facilities want to talk about the ash. None of these facilities want to actually mention these things that are really horrible about incinerating. So it really is important to push them to understand. Even some of the directors that we spoke to didn't even understand how toxic the ash was. They were not using any safety methods in trucking the ash out of the incinerator and to the landfill, because they figured it must not be toxic if it's going to a landfill. But ash has been tested on the, I'm pretty sure you can find information of it on the GAIA website, in the reports of how toxic it is. And yeah, I can't emphasize enough how much you need to really push these political leaders and the owners and operators of these facilities to better understand the waste that comes out of an incinerator in the form of toxic ash.
So there is a question from RA. I'm not able to recognize the full name because it just says RA. What do you propose for biomedical waste? I'm a blood donor, and I feel responsible that the bags that my blood is stored in the needles, the tubes, are going to be incinerated.
Yeah, Denise, do you know more about biomedical?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the biomedical waste management, there are rules and regulations in India, and there are protocols are also being framed. And I still remember some 15 years back, I visited Bangalore, and I saw one of the best biomedical waste management facility in the city. That was in Command Hospital. So biomedical waste management, if you look at the total waste, it is just less than 5% of the waste need to be like handled separately, because they are a biohazard. And if you look at the burning things, it's very less. And it's mostly body parts and gauze with body fluids, things like that. Otherwise, you need not to have a kind of an incinerator. And this hospital under Air Force, Indian Air Force, and I have found that they were doing source segregation, and they do disinfection and autoclaving, and then even they were doing vermicomposting of some of the materials, and they're sending every plastic used in that facility for, like including the tubings, everything, for recycling. After disinfection, they shred it, they disinfect, shred, and then send it for recycling. the sharps, the metals, everything disinfected, and then it is mutilated and sent for recycling. So there are working protocols, live examples are available. I don't know the scenario right now in Bangalore. If you are in Bangalore, you can just check with the command hospital. It was one of the best model in India. But right now we have a model in Nepal, in Bir Hospital, that is similar to what I have seen in command hospital. And it is possible. The only problem is that these incinerator companies are actually luring the medical facilities so that they can actually avoid taking the responsibility of managing biomedical waste. So they just sent everything to the incinerators and they just burn it, and they are charging per bed basis, number of beds or number of kgs of waste per basis. And it is very easy for them. It is actually convenient for them, but it is not scientifically a right way to do this, and it is not economically a right way to do this. So there are actually there are solutions for managing biomedical waste even in the rural scenario.
So I think thank you, Shibu. I think there is a conversation itself happening on the chat. So impossible to filter out questions. But having said that, we have a raised hand from BAB. I don't know the name of the person, so I would probably unmute you so that you can ask your question, BAB.
Hi, Katie and Denise. Thank you so much for your presentation. Katie, particularly since you spoke about Detroit and its fight against WtEs, Detroit has a rich history of its local food movement as well, and there was a lot of racial movements as well. So you come from a city with a rich history, and I'm not surprised that this fight of yours is also coming from the same city. My question was particularly since you talked about the plant situated so close to human habitation. And US was the first country to implement environmental impact assessment across the world. What do EIA for these plants talk about from across the United States? How are they allowed so close to human habitation?
Well, in Detroit's case, and I'm sure Denise can maybe talk a little bit more about this nationwide, but in Detroit, this plant was built in the 1986 and had very little understanding of the harmful effects because the policymakers here were told that it's, you know, like you're being told right now, that it's going to be clean air coming out of these stacks, that they're going to have the best technology and filter everything. And when they first were built, they didn't have the filters that they had in the later years. And the city thought that they were going to make a ton of money off of this facility. So they were thinking that it was going to be a really great thing to have, that they were able to save a lot of money and make more money by taking in trash from other cities. But in the end, it was actually Canada that came and sued Detroit, because Canada's right across the river here, because of the health effects that they were receiving in their communities across the river from this facility rising up. So in the first few years that this facility was built, there's also documentation of mushrooms growing everywhere in people's backyards because of the amount of toxins, and people didn't even know where they were coming from. There's dust from the facility that was landing on people's cars. It was really a horrible scene. So they had to learn a lot of the hard ways in this facility in particular. But maybe Denise can talk a little bit more about the Environmental Protection Act or the air quality.
I think we have significantly overshot our time. We are already at 8:30. I think, Denise, what time is your next meeting?
It's about to start. It's with one of my staff folks, but I actually missed one with my other staff folks.
Okay.
I wanted to, if it's okay, I can answer the question very quickly because I think it's important, and then I can sign off.
Please do. Please do.
Okay, great. So in terms of regulations, I think one of the interesting things to understand about the US is that there was an incredible environmental movement that really took off over the course of the 1970s and into the 80s, which really, or the 60s and into the 70s and then into the 80s, And a lot of what caused that was because people were witnessing in their communities incredible environmental damage. And like fires were happening on rivers in the US, like literally the water was catching on fire because of all of the pollution. And so there was an incredible movement of people from across the country, which led to a lot of the environmental regulations here in the US. It led to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It led to the solid waste management rules that currently oversee our waste management. But what ended up happening was over time, a lot of those responsibilities, especially around waste management, were handed over to states and then were left to cities and municipalities and states to actually pay for and manage. And so what we're seeing now is a result of a lot of that, where, you know, we've already heard folks on the call talking about how great incineration companies make waste, this sound like an incredible solution to city officials, and are easily able to sway and sell them on dealing with an incredible waste problem. And like, what do you do with a giant pile of waste? And I think that's what we're really up against. And so in the US, it's been continuing. Incinerators, we've launched enough of a movement to be able to prevent any new incinerators from being built so far, and want to continue to fight to shut down the ones that do exist. As KT mentioned, it's much harder to shut down an incinerator once it's already been built, and they operate for at least 30 years on average. And so I think it's incredible that all of you are, you know, part of this webinar, and it's really been great to have the opportunity to speak to everybody, and really give a lot of credit to Deepu and to a lot of you who've been organizing against the proposal of this incinerator. So I just wanted to say, like, it takes a movement of people to really affect change, and I think it's really important that all of you continue this fight, and I'm more than happy to continue to, you know, help or support you however I can, bring in other speakers. And I know Shibu, as our contact in India for GAIA, has been doing an incredible job as well, and really, really strongly recommend reaching out to him as well to address any additional questions. And finally, just want to say thank you for this opportunity. And it's okay that we went over because it was great to do it. But if there's any other questions, I'm sure Deepu can send them to us too.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining today. So probably we will take 2 more questions before we close. Already there is a question from Vinod. I don't know, Vinod is still on the call. Yeah, Vinod is still on the call. So Vinod, as a devil's advocate, he has posed this question about incinerators for reject and hospital waste. In this new context during COVID times, don't you think that incinerators are important for reject and hospital waste? He said not being a devil's advocate, but I think it is okay to be a devil's advocate. So I'll pose this question. I mean, if you have 2 more minutes, you can probably try to answer it first, Dennis, or I'll pose it to Shibu and Kate.
Yeah, I can quickly answer that. We're definitely seeing incinerator companies saying that they are the solution to a lot of the COVID waste. The part of the problem is, like, we know that a lot of single-use products are going in to protect ourselves from coronavirus, including masks and gloves and all of these things. But the problem really is that we're trying to address a public health problem by causing another public health problem. Most of the waste that is produced in response to COVID doesn't actually need to be burned or treated. The virus doesn't last that long in the environment. And so the idea that burning is the solution to deal with this infectious disease is not a valid argument. In the US, a lot of hospitals are now contracting with companies that can do other types of sanitation methods to reuse masks. So like the N95 mask, which is the most protective one, is being treated with hydrogen peroxide in a closed loop system. And that means the masks can actually be reused repeatedly, especially for healthcare workers. And so I think it's really important to just keep all of those things in mind. And I don't actually think that's a solution. I also recommend contacting folks at Healthcare Without Harm. They've been doing incredible work around medical waste incineration, especially in light of the COVID crisis.
Would you like to add something to it, Katie, Shibu?
Just really quickly that my community is experiencing a lot more problems with COVID-19 because it's a respiratory problem, and or it's usually it hits in your respiratory areas, and because we live so close to an incinerator and we already have health effects from the incinerator, incinerating more waste is not going to help any community in this case. So I don't know if Shibu has anything else to add.
Thank you, Katie. Shibu, yeah, please. You're on mute, Shibu. You'll have to. What? Shibu, you're still on mute.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think I was out of this discussion for a couple of minutes because of the poor connection. And two things. One, on the environmental impact assessments, there was a question. Please understand that in India, environmental impact assessment is made by a company for the company, like they bring the company. So they give only positive reports. So far, we have seen this in many projects, not just in waste incineration, but even in other projects which have some impact on environmental side or ecology or people or socioeconomic impacts. Most of the time, the company is being hired by, that is a system we have. The company who is proposing a project has to hire an agency from the panel listed by the government, and most of them are actually supported by corporates or with other stakes. So there is, you can't expect a kind of a clean report from an environmental impact assessment. That is one. Second, there was a question about like on this COVID scenario. Yes, the COVID PP kits, actually they can be disinfected and shredded and can be recycled. There are technology, because you can just use the same liquid which is used for disinfection to disinfect the COVID PPs. It need not be sent to the burning facilities. But right now, the Central Pollution Control Board have issued a circular to all state governments to send it to the medical waste management facilities. That is going to create a problem for our incinerators. Already, most of the medical waste incinerators are working above their limits, and at any point of time that can get stuck. So that is a second question. And third, there was a question from I think Muralidhar Rao on that funding about GAIA. GAIA is actually a kind of a network organization. A network organization means it works with grassroots level organizations and individuals. So most of the grassroots level organizations have their own funding options, like they have their own funding sources, like they do consulting projects to make money, and they do social enterprise businesses, and they also get some charitable, most of them have that charitable society or a trust kind of a status, and they get donations from public. And GAIA channelizes funding from different organizations in different parts of the world. There are a couple of funding organizations who are interested in environmental issues or on the waste pickers issue. So they are also like channelizing the funds. So GAIA utilizing that resources and making it available for the grassroots level organizations, as well as for the campaigns, research, and the kind of policy work in the region. But most of the fund, like if you look at the GAIA, the global, the most of the funds are with the grassroots level organizations. They generate the resources locally. Mostly it is from the local resources. And GAIA is actually giving a kind of a technical support, information support, and to an extent there is a kind of a financial support for selected projects. And that comes from the global sources which are working in the field of environmental justice and health. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibu. I think, I don't know whose comment it is. The comment has come from Nokia 3.1 Plus. I found it to be more like a closing statement than a question. So I would just read it out for everybody. So thank you to all, a very informative session, but need to make support system and in this institutional linkage with recycling industries, and the state government or local bodies started decentralized management, need support for forward linkage for dry waste management. So, and high voltage campaign on the science of waste management, especially eco-friendly approach at all levels of lobbying the power structure. The gist of it is absolutely correct, right? So we need high voltage campaigns on the science of waste management, and to work with different levels and lobby effectively at different levels of power structures for good waste management practices to work on the ground. That is what Katie was also talking about. Katie, would you like to make some closing comments? We'll probably close in another 2 minutes. I think we don't have any more questions at this point.
Yeah, I would just like to thank you for inviting me to this call. It's a very unique experience that you are all having. It's not every day you have a proposed incinerator in your town, and I'm very happy that you reached out to me in my campaign that had to work so long at shutting an incinerator down. So you understand what a possible next step is if you do end up having an incinerator. But I think seeing so many people interested and passionate about learning and understanding the harmful effects of incineration really gives me hope that you all are going to stop this before it starts. And I wish you the best of luck. I will be here and share my contact information if something else comes up. I definitely would love to share more about any community outreach and personal experiences of incineration, which is my expertise at this moment. So I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for joining this session, and thank you for spending so much time with us today. And I hope it was informative for everybody who joined. In Bangalore, we are faced with an imminent onslaught of several WtE plants across the city. So I think she has been very categorical when she spoke to me. She said that this is the time to not let them come up. And if they come up, they will be there for at least 30-35 years. And I think it is important that as Bangaloreans, we understand this, and we also propagate this message amongst the larger community, so that we can continue our journey towards sustainable waste management rather than towards these quick solutions. It's a long journey, but I hope that everybody, I hope we are able to educate everybody and align them in this journey. Thank you, Katie. Thanks to Denise for joining us as well. Thank you, Shibu, for your time, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar. Would love to connect at any point in time. You can connect with me as well in Bangalore, to discuss this. My email ID is mentioned in the chat window. Phone number is also there. If you want to get in touch with Denise or Katie also, you can get in touch with me. I will connect you to Denise, Katie, and Shibu. So thank you for your time. I have also pasted 2 articles that I wrote for Citizen Matters about the WtEs in Bangalore. In case you have not read that, please take your time to read. Thank you once again, everybody, for joining, and thank you, Katie, for your time. Thank you, Shibu. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.